Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. We had a really good day, and hopefully we can end it on a high note. This is the last panel of the day, and we're going to talk about growth, Europe, and what the new growth model for Europe should look like. And as you know, we are on Twitter, we're also on Slido. Any questions that you have, we are going to look at them, and we will make sure that we put them to our speakers. So send anything that you want to ask using this hashtag that we have, EUBEF19. And now I'm just going to introduce the panelists that we have. The Vice President of the European Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, the Spanish Finance Minister, Nadia Calviño. And we also have the IMF Chief Economist, Gita Gopinath, Professor Jackson from the University of Surrey, and Riccardo Illy from Illy Group. And just to get the discussion going, a very brief question from all of you, which is very simple. Does Europe need more growth, and what do we do with that growth to make it more inclusive? Vice President.
I would say Europe needs more growth, but Europe doesn't need growth for the sake of growth. So the question is rather that we need to improve well-being of the people. So when we discuss growth, we also need to look that this growth is inclusive, that it benefits all people in the society, that it's fair, that it promotes social mobility, that the outcomes of people's incomes are not predetermined by their social origins or place of birth. And of course, we need to look that this growth is sustainable. So looking at the ecological footprint, looking at the climate change, and in this area, urgent action is needed. So we need to actually combine all these factors.
And Minister, more growth, and what do we do with it?
Yeah, I was reflecting as I was listening to Valdis. Well, before we started the panel, I thought we're all going to agree. Of course, we need more growth, and it needs to be sustainable and inclusive. So let's get this done with. But I was reflecting also, listening and looking through the program that you had this morning, and populism and how to deal with the expectations of citizens, that in many parts of Europe, at least this is the case in Spain, Europe was a promise of prosperity. It was welfare, it was really having a richer society, but not only in terms of GDP, but rather in terms of welfare for the people. And this is the dream, this is the image, this is the offer of Europe. And so we need to ensure that we protect our values and that we preserve all the other elements that Europe means to all of us, but we also need to preserve our ability to continue to be prosperous, which does not only mean GDP growth, but I think we will have a lot of opportunities to go through the details.
We are, Professor, what's your take on this?
Again, it's hard to disagree, but let me put some numbers out there, which is to your question of does Europe need more growth? The answer is yes, absolutely. If you look at what's been happening to per capita income over the last 12 years in the euro area or the European Union, we've seen about over the last 12 years an increase of only 5%. So it's been mediocre, the growth has been mediocre. Secondly, the growth has been fragile, which means that if you look at the frequency of recessions, the depth of recessions, they have been much higher in the last 20 years in the euro area as compared to other advanced economies. And secondly, there hasn't been sufficient convergence across countries in Europe. So these are the facts and we need to address them. But then, as was pointed out, growth doesn't mean necessarily that it comes at the expense of inclusiveness or of being concerned about the climate. I think what needs to be changed in the framework that we use for growth is to say that whenever we consider a policy and we evaluate the impact of that on growth, we simultaneously evaluate the impact of that on society, both in terms of inclusiveness and in terms of climate. And that is not something that typically gets done. It was never done in the past. But I think that would be the right framework to use for growth.
And Professor Jackson, I know you have some ideas which may be different, so if you could share them with us.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe first we can sort of agree on what we can agree on, which is that we definitely need a growth in well-being, in people's well-being, and we definitely need a growth in inclusion. That's very easy to agree on. What's harder to agree on is the means through which we should achieve that, and the means through which conventionally we're supposed to have achieved that is through growth in conventional terms in the gross domestic product, in the GDP. We all know that it's not a very good measure. It's been recognized for 50 years. Robert Kennedy 50 years ago said that the GDP measures neither our wit, nor our courage, nor our wisdom, nor our learning, neither our compassion, nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything except, he said, that which makes life worthwhile. So we have a poor measure with which to achieve what we all agree on. And the question is Europe then capable of turning round the growth model that is built over 40 or 50 years to describe a really adequate economy that meets the needs of everybody? Because that's really what well-being demands. And when you look at where that has failed in the past, it's failed very specifically because the goal of increasing the GDP has trumped all those laudable social and environmental goals which we can all agree on. So it isn't enough, as Gita said, to put every decision through the lens of its impacts on society and the lens of its impacts on the environment. We have also to ensure that when the environment is suffering or when inclusion is suffering, GDP growth is not allowed to trump those goals. We need an inclusive society. There are no jobs on a dead planet, as Sharon Burrows said very recently, and it's an apt metaphor for the situation we find ourselves in which we've chased relentlessly after this GDP growth and thrown away the social goals that lie at the heart of the vision of Europe.
So it's pretty clear GDP doesn't really fully work in your eyes. I'm sure we're going to revisit that concept in a bit. And Mr. Illy, you're a businessman. You see it perhaps from a different perspective. Does Europe need more growth, and what do you do with that?
First of all, I would say that any organism needs to grow. So we need to grow as states, we need to grow in our companies, we need also to grow as individuals. So talking about the states, we are interested in letting grow the GDP, and financially speaking, that's the element we need. When we compare, for example, our debt, we compare it to the GDP. We can compare it with the quality of life that maybe is more interesting for the people, for the consumers. In the first case, we prefer to have a certain level of inflation when talking about the states, because the inflation is eroding our debt, and this is important, especially for very indebted countries like Italy. But if we are consumer, we probably prefer deflation, because that means that with a stable income, we will have the possibility to buy more products and more services. And this is likely to be the future we are going to face. And then I think we need not only to grow, but also to reduce inequality in the space. So we have to reduce the differences between richer and poorer, but also in the time. When we indebt our countries, we are taking the money from our children, from our grandchildren. And if now the next generation are expecting to be less wealthy than we are now, than the present generation, that means that they have exactly the feeling that we are taking and using their money and not always we are using it properly. So I don't think that measures like flat taxes or early retirement, that are measures that are proposed in Italy, for example, are measures that are able to reduce the inequality.
Well, thank you very much, and I can see you're sending your questions, so please keep sending them because I will ask them. So I think we all agree that we need more growth and we need to make sure that it's more inclusive. But I want to ask Professor Gopinath specifically in detail, what reforms does Europe need to get to this point?
Before I jump into that, I thought I would just flag one thing related to what Tim said, which is that measures of GDP don't capture anything worth living for, don't reflect anything worth living for. Now, there have been many studies.
Robert Kennedy said it.
Yes, that you absolutely, that you pointed out. There have been studies that look at surveys of well-being, measures of happiness, multiple surveys that show that there's a very strong positive relationship between incomes as measured by GDP and happiness. So I completely agree that there is many other measures we need to care about, but even if you look at measures of just pure happiness, they seem to be countries that have higher GDP per capita tend to be countries where people are happier. This is across countries and even within countries and over time. Now, to your question about what particular reforms need to be undertaken for Europe, I'm not going to say anything that's dramatically new, but I feel it has to be emphasized multiple times. You need reforms which are union-wide, and that is a stronger banking union, a stronger capital markets union, and a central fiscal capacity. And also we need national structural reforms. We recently put out a paper that points out that we need reforms on labor markets, on product markets, and with respect to corporate insolvency. And before I go into these things, let me just flag a couple of things. Why do I think these reforms are important? These reforms are very important to build resilience. We live in complicated times. We live where the global economy is slowing. The prospects of a major downturn, could happen in the not so distant future. It is therefore very important to build resilience, because if we don't have the resilience, the people who are the most affected are the people in the lowest income bracket who don't have sufficient savings. So we need to deal with that. Another point I will make is that whenever somebody says, okay, we need labor market reforms, the first instinct is, okay, well, you're being neoliberal, and this is entirely about growth, and you're ignoring inclusiveness. And again, I will completely push back on that, because there are many models, there are Nordic models, along with Anglo-Saxon, there are Nordic models that will show you that you can have greater labor and product market flexibility, while at the same time ensuring protection for workers. And a classic example would be Denmark, where it's a large state, there's significant redistribution, there is strong unemployment insurance, there is strong facilities for helping people find jobs. Now that's an economy that still has flexible labor markets and is able to be resilient. So structural reforms is not an anathema to doing something that's friendly for the climate and friendly for people.
And now that we talked about specific policies, the European Commission has made it clear that it wants to be, or at least aim to be, carbon neutral by 2050. The question, and I want to ask you, Professor Jackson, this is, can you be conscious of the environment and still continue to grow? Is there a trade-off eventually at one point?
There's a trade-off when the economy stops working properly because the climate is broken. That's absolutely clear. And that's the point about, there's no jobs on a dead planet. It's overstatement, of course, but it comes from actually a union leader who's concerned about climate change and who recognizes that a short-term focus on just having jobs is going to cost everyone in the longer term. The science tells us that we have to reach carbon neutral actually before 2050, and some northern European countries have targets. Norway has a target of 2030, Finland has a target of 2035, Sweden has a target of 2045 to reach carbon neutral. The people out on the streets to whom we should be listening, not only because they have the wisdom of school children and the rebelliousness of activists, are telling us they would like a target for a climate neutral northern developed country of 2025, that's 6 years' time. Is that nonsense? Is that complete madness? It isn't. If you can direct your investment, direct your spending strategies, direct your fiscal incentives, direct your monetary incentives towards the kind of transformation that is needed. What has stopped us doing that so far? 1.3 trillion euros is being talked about in the next multi-annual financial settlement. 2.6 trillion euros was put through the European Central Bank in the period between March 2015 and December 2018 in pure money, fiscal monetary stimulus to keep the Eurozone afloat through the central bank. 6 months after giving up that target, Mario Draghi was online today promising another fiscal stimulus. We weren't looking because we weren't looking at our phones except in the lunch break. But it has unleashed a transatlantic storm because Donald Trump is crying foul, and the European Union, of course, is trying to protect the stability of the Eurozone. The point is that is huge amounts of money. And those huge amounts of money at the moment are doing nothing towards the investments that we need towards a climate-friendly economy. They're going nowhere towards meeting a net zero target, certainly not by 2035, and probably not even by 2050, unless we can turn those things round. The question of economic growth as narrowly measured by the GDP is a complete fiction. It's a dream to believe that we can continue to exponentially grow our economies on a finite planet without investing in the resources that give us prosperity today and tomorrow.
Well, okay. So I'm happy you actually mentioned money, and if anyone here disagrees about the comments on Mr. Mario Draghi, then feel free to jump in. But the question I want to put to the Vice President now has to do with essentially money. Who's going to pay for this? Because this transition, of course, is going to cost money. How do you fund it?
Maybe let's come back to this broader question whether there is a contradiction between reducing emissions and growth. We believe there isn't, because if you look at EU's economy between 1990 and 2017, EU's economy has grown 58%. And at the same time, we have reduced emissions 22%. So we see that the economy is growing and emissions is going down. Then also, of course, there's a question what this climate transition is going to take also in terms of jobs. And actually it's assessment of, it's our assessment, but it's also assessment of International Labour Organization, of OECD, that this carbon transition is going to have moderately positive effect on jobs. So once again, we do not see contradictions there. But in any case, you are right, it will require massive investment. So there are different estimates how much additional investment it will require. But in any case, they range somewhere between 170, 180 to 280 billion euros per year of additional investment. And clearly, we will need also financial sector, financial markets to play their part in this transition, and that's where our Sustainable Finance Action Plan comes in, which we have adopted last year, followed by 3 legislative proposals, and just today we published 3 reports of a technical expert group working in this area of sustainable finance. So we actually need to steer the firepower of international and also European financial markets to green and sustainable economic activities. And that's probably a missing link to ensure that there is also financing for this climate transition.
And Minister Calviño, I want to ask you again on climate change, because I know your government is very committed to the Paris Climate Accord. So as a policymaker, do you actually have the fiscal space to make sure that you can put these measures in place? And then secondly, do you think the EU should do any kind of business deals with countries that do not respect the Paris Accord deal?
Well, that's many issues in a question. No? And let me start where Mr. Illy actually left it, which is this issue of intergenerational justice and fairness, no? And the promise that Europe meant for all of us, and that it should mean for our children and grandchildren if we want the European dream, to continue to live on. I don't think that there's a contradiction. The right question, in my view, should be, can we continue to grow if we do not deal with climate change? And this is the whole idea of sustainability, so I don't think that we have a choice. We submitted the plan, the National Energy and Climate Plan, which was actually assessed by the Commission today, precisely to try to provide this midterm perspective, an ambitious view on how to get there and start planning, because I think in this area the ostrich approach, hiding your head, burying your head in the floor, on the soil, trying to let it pass is not the right one. So we want to really take this head on, because Europe, and in any case this is what Spain thinks, should be at the vanguard of this process. We have a lot of assets, we have a lot of advantages, and this is the right moment to do so. Amongst other things, because interest rates are really low. So I come back to Mr. Jackson's point, which is this is the right moment to do these investments and to undertake these investments. Should this be taken only by public investment? Certainly not. No, we need to mobilize private investment. And for that, we need to give certainty, this plan. We need to make sure that we will accompany the transition process and deal with the most affected sectors: energy, car production, agro, food industry, all these sectors. We also need to ensure that the transition is fair, that we take care not only of the companies, but also of the people, so that nobody's left behind. And this requires a whole range of regulations and other actions on the side of the public sector, which necessarily have to take place at the European level. We're talking about a global challenge which cannot be undertaken at the national level. But all of these put into a plan should give the legal certainty for investors to also see this as the most important element for the future. And to my mind, we have no choice but to do this if we really want this prosperity that we have lived through to continue for our children and grandchildren, which I think is possible, actually. I'm much more optimistic in thinking that we are able to continue to deliver this kind of prosperity and welfare for our children and grandchildren if we take the right decisions today.
And Mr. Illy, my question to you is actually very simple. Can you be a businessman, want to continue to make money, but also care about the environment?
Yes, I'm sure that any entrepreneur can do it, and I think that the role of companies and of corporations in sustainability can be really vital. About 8 years ago, Peter Drucker wrote in his book about management, he can be considered the inventor of management, that the main goal of each company is to satisfy the needs of its customers, of its consumer. But then he added, the company also needs to satisfy the needs of all the stakeholders. He also invented the term stakeholder. And that means the employees, the supplier, the local environment, social and environmentally speaking, place where the company is working. So you will wonder, what about profits? And Professor Drucker added, profits has to be considered the cost of future, because companies are competing each other. So if you want to be able to compete also tomorrow, you need to innovate. And if you want to innovate, you have to have some profits to reinvest in research and development and innovation. This is the model we are following in all the companies of our group. So we think that sustainability, that means economic, and this is normal for each company, social and environmental is really important for us. When I'm talking about social responsibility, I am not only talking about, let's say, the employee and the local environment where we are working, but also about the growers that are producing coffee, cocoa, tea for us, and that are working in developing countries, and often are paid for their goods less than their cost. So the first rule we established was we want to pay them always, despite the market prices, at a price that is covering all their costs, leave a margin, and possibly leave a premium if they supply a quality higher than our minimum demand. And talking about the environmental sustainability, we are also engaged in teaching them how to grow, reducing the impact on the environment, and we do the same in the production. So just to make an example, about 10 years ago, maybe more, we introduced a system to recuperate all the heat that was previously dispersed in the atmosphere while roasting the coffee, and we use it to heat all the offices and the factory during the winter, and even to cool it during the summer. And on the factory we put about 1 megawatt solar panels, so we are producing as much electricity by renewable as possible. And I think that for companies it's important not to wait regulation. Companies should anticipate the times, commit themselves in sustainability before, in one hand, the regulator will do it, but in the other hand, the consumer will punish them if they don't do it. Already in the United States, we had some customers saying us, if you are not committed in sustainability, we won't treat anymore your products. And this was, let's say, not a reason to commit ourselves, but a reason to get, as first company, a certification on responsible supply chain. So what I was telling to you previously is controlled and certified by DNV, which is a Danish company making the certification, and we were the very first getting this certification.
So earlier we were talking about how to measure economic success, and at one point Professor Jackson said, I don't think GDP should be the only figure, and you applauded, so it does seem that that's something that hit a nerve. So I want to put the same question to the Vice President and just say, do you think we've maybe focused too much on the macro figures and neglected other areas, maybe healthcare, education, and how do you bring the two together?
First of all, as regards macro figures, of course, macro figures are related to the well-being of the people. One could say, okay, what we really would need to be focusing is well-being of the people. And there, if you look at the Eurostat data, so what are the main issues people are concerned at personal level? I can mention top 5 things: cost of living, unemployment, health and social policy, pensions. So as you see, those are all actually tangible things. And when we discuss about concepts like inclusive growth, that's exactly what we are covering, making sure that economic growth is actually benefiting people. And when we introduced a European pillar of social rights, once again, the aim was very same, to ensure that people are benefiting from this economic growth, and that number of social indicators are, so to say, followed through, and we are not looking only at economic growth, but we are also seeing how it's reflected in social indicators. And already for last couple of years, this is an approach which we are following when coordinating member states' economic and fiscal policies in European semester. We put increasing focus exactly on those social aspects. So in a sense, short answer to this question, yes, I agree we should be concentrating more on social and welfare issues, and that's exactly what we are doing.
And Minister, I'm sure you do pay attention to the quarterly GDP figures when you get them, because you have to turn them into policy. Do you think there's a disconnect?
I think indeed that there's a risk that we think that we're measuring what we see, but actually we only see what we measure. And 1 year ago I was here in another panel, and we were discussing one of the key areas which is not valued when we're talking about GDP, which is a part of the activities which are usually performed by women, no? Non-paid job, work in the house, the economics of care, and this means that this is a part of our value added which is not taken care of. I think it's quite symptomatic that one of the last additions we brought to the calculations of GDP under our EU rules was prostitution. You know, I think that one has to reflect on whether we shouldn't be looking at other issues also. A second element is indeed the whole environmental issue. the value added which comes from saving, no? The fact that you do calculate when you have to pay a company to clean up a disaster, but you do not calculate the value added of not having the disaster in the first place. I don't say this is easy, but this is something, and the externalities element, I think needs to be integrated in our analysis. Obviously, a third area, just let me mention this, is digital economy. I mean, everybody agrees that data is the new oil, and actually we do not calculate the value added coming from data, which is a key issue when we're discussing taxation, for example. No? These are just three elements which are key in our policy design and which are not integrated when we're just calculating GDP. Does it mean that GDP per capita is not a good indicator? No, I would agree with Gita 100%. It's a starting point, but we need to go beyond. I think that the fact that the Commission is now looking at the social pillar is a step in the right direction, but more work needs to be done. We strongly support, for example, the OECD, which is trying to look at other indicators. I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated if we want to really look at this long-term sustainability and social inclusion dimension of growth.
And just to follow up on the question that we just asked the Minister, Professor Gopinath, do you think we should reassess how we measure economic success?
I completely agree that we need to look at other measures of economic progress and economic well-being besides GDP, absolutely. And in fact, the good news is that many organizations, many institutions are doing that at this point. So even at the International Monetary Fund, we are looking at measures of inequality in income, inequality in consumption, inequality in wealth. Now, it is indeed the case that there isn't as readily available data on these measures as GDP is reported for most countries. So that is a limitation, but that is a hole that has to be filled. So we're going into that. I mean, the OECD has a major program to build more data on these measures of inequality. The United Nations has a program to figure out sustainability in terms of environmental impact. So we are working on it. So I think that this is, this is hugely important, and it's important for us to look at the numbers. But this is also translating into policy. So for instance, in our own surveillance work that we do for countries, we report not just upon how well the economy is doing on average, but how it is being distributed. So for instance, as a concrete example, in the most recent surveillance note that we did for the United States, we said that the US economy was growing strong, it was in a good place, but then we also said in the very next paragraph that inequality was a major concern, and it was a problem. And similarly, we flagged issues with the environment. And also, when we say inequality, of course, typically we used to think of income and wealth inequality, but there are many other kinds of inequality in the form of gender inequality, inequality with minorities. And so there is a lot that's underlying it, and these are facts that we need to know and has to be a part of the policy toolkit.
And Professor Jackson, we'll follow up on what you said earlier, which is GDP to me doesn't actually really matter that much. I guess many others will tell you there are real repercussions when you forget about one measure and you just look at one thing. What about debt, deficits? What about the everyday reality of countries that maybe need to fund themselves in the market? And also fundamentally, how do you reduce inequality if you don't grow? I guess that's a big question.
Okay, first of all, so I'm not saying that we should get rid of the GDP. It might seem a little counterintuitive that I'm saying this on the panel. I work with the GDP every day. It's a very good measure. It's an extraordinary construct because it measures not just the output of the economy, but the incomes of the people and where they spend them on. And when you put together the GDP, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's so attractive, all of those things add up. They all have to add up if you've done your accounts right. The GDP is a way of measuring the busyness of the economy, what it produces, what it consumes, and where it's spent. It doesn't tell us about the things that matter. Now, let me just come back because Gita challenged me rightly on that point in terms of the statistics in relation to well-being. Does well-being follow the GDP? And the data on that is exactly where the issue becomes really pertinent because the data are heavily dominated by the increase in well-being associated with every dollar of extra income when you are poor. And at that point, we know that every income rise gives a great deal of prosperity as its benefit. And then there comes a turning point. It's around about $10,000 per capita. And at that point, every curve you look at begins to flatten out. There are diminishing returns to income growth above that 10,000 point within countries, across countries, and in some cases there are negative returns to growth as measured by the GDP because of all the externalities like the conditions of people's lives, the unpaid housework, the congestion on the streets, the accidents and the carnage that fill our hospitals with people who are the victims of that, and indeed the environmental impacts that we're not costing into account. Past a certain point, the GDP is a very, very poor measure of well-being. That doesn't make it a bad measure of the structure of the economy. It does make it the wrong thing to focus. We have our eyes on the wrong prize. We've had it like that for 80 years. In the process, we've missed our climate goals. We've increased inequality in quite drastic ways. So the income growth that has happened in Europe has gone predominantly to the top 0.001%, who saw a 4% annual average growth in their incomes from 1980 to the present day. The poorest saw virtually none, and yet that is where income growth makes a difference in terms of prosperity, real well-being for the poorest people in the world.
And can I just ask you to follow up on this? If you're a country and there is an everyday economic reality behind every country, and you say, well, I'm not really growing and I have a big debt pile, but my citizens are happy and we're tackling climate change, how would that go down? Is that realistic?
Are you asking me again? Good. Okay, so I want to come back to numbers here because we should not fool ourselves about the reality of money. I want to just do a little bit of arithmetic. Valdis very kindly provided me with the investment spend needed to meet a net zero climate goal, and it's around about 300 billion euros a year. And if you take the two figures that I mentioned at the beginning, so 2.6 trillion in quantitative easing through the European Central Bank and 1.3 in the multi-sector financial settlement over the next 7 years, that's 3.9 trillion divided by 300 billion, around about 13 years. So in the amount of money that we have thrown and plan to throw at the EU economy in the last decades, we could actually achieve a 13-year period of reduction year on year on year of the carbon intensity of the economy without having to leverage the private sector. The private sector would rush into that space with that sort of leverage without having to do any more quantitative easing than we already did through a stimulus over a 2.5-year period, and with a legitimate possibility that we would actually save our economy from the position of having an absolutely unworkable climate in about 10 to 12 years' time. Those are real demands, financial, fiscal, monetary demands on Europe that will not be solved until we look at the reality of converting our measures of GDP and our vision of what well-being is towards the things that are important for planet, vital to inequality and reducing inequality, and indeed even can offer us more financial stability than we've managed over the last decade since the financial crisis. It's not about what can you do about paying off debt if you want not your GDP to grow. It's actually to look at the way that we run our economies, to recognize that we're running them wrongly, and to put in place institutions, measures and policies that will allow us to achieve real social priorities.
And Mr. Illy, from a business perspective, so from a business perspective, how do you balance the two? Clearly, you need to make a business case, you need to have production, you need to make money, but also take care of your staff. How do you do the two together?
In this time, we are concerned about robotization, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, and we fear that this will raise unemployment. But I think that our concern should be exactly the opposite, because we are in a population which is shrinking. The birth rate is declining. In Italy, we are the second worst worldwide, with only 1.3 children per female. But France, which is the best in Europe, has 1.9, which is still not yet sufficient to maintain a stable population. But in the last years, we also said we don't want any more immigrants. So our problem will be to produce more, so to grow our GDP. I think to grow more in quality than in quantity, because we need not to consume more, probably we need to consume better, also better food, better drinks, better cars, less polluting, better housing, and so on, with less people, not the same people, because even if the span of life has almost doubled in 1 century, it was about 42 years at the beginning of last century, and now it's over 80, I don't think we will have a stable number of workers. So I think we will have to thank automatization, robotization, artificial intelligence that will allow us to produce better, maybe even more, with less people, if we continue with the policy of not letting any immigrants enter our continent anymore. I wonder if we will be able to further reduce the working time per day. Probably there is a natural working time, and it could be 8 hours a day, but maybe we will reduce the number of days we are working, not even anymore 5, maybe only 4.5. Already many companies are doing this, and on Friday after midday they stop working. But for sure we will have a much higher productivity with less people working, and so producing more, and especially producing better. But then I think that the labor will become more and more liquid. Already today you have many people working through smartphones when they are just traveling, going to their working place, or maybe just staying home, or even being in vacation. And probably this, except some jobs that need your presence, let's say, in the factory close to the machines, will become the rule, so more liquid labor. And this will bring us to a change in the compensation. Now we still think to rewards for labor linked to the number of hours, except managers, of course. I think that the measurement of the results of the work in terms of productivity, in terms of results, will become more and more available worldwide, and we will reward the people not anymore for the number of hours worked, but for the result they will bring. I think that this will be a quite huge revolution that will involve, first of all, companies, but of course also regulators, the European Union and the states, because many laws will be changed, or we will need to change them to adapt to this new situation.
So I'm going to take a break from my questions, and now I'm going to take your questions. We've actually had some really interesting ones on Twitter and Slido. There's one in particular that's had quite a lot of impact and says, when you look at artificial intelligence, is that going to help or hinder inclusive growth? Who wants to take it? And feel free to debate among yourselves.
Happy to respond. It's also a little bit of a response to Riccardo. I think the question was raised in an earlier panel, and someone wisely said that technology is neither in itself benign or malevolent, and that's certainly true of the kinds of technologies that exist through the AI and digital revolution. Does it have the power, the potential, that revolution, to destabilize our economies? Yes, I think it does. And the reason for that actually goes back to something that Riccardo was talking about, which is about the proceeds of the revenues from production and where they are distributed in society. Our bargain, and it's a bargain that was set up by neoclassical economics, actually, interestingly, is exactly the one that Riccardo was asking for, namely that people are rewarded in return for their labor productivity. In other words, the amount of output they can achieve in a given hour. And that bargain works in economies which are driven by manufacturing, by mining, and to some extent by AI, because it is a technology-rich sector of the economy, very capital-intensive. And what it does is essentially is to make every task that you can do faster and faster and faster, except some of the tasks that matter most in society, like caring for people, like producing things which will last for a long time, like creating quality of life through art and literature and sculpture, and indeed participation in society in events like this. So it's very, very difficult to push productivity growth in those sectors of society that are, interestingly, also low carbon, high employment intensity, and absolutely vital to health, education, social care, culture, creativity, and the quality of our lives. That's the potential that we are looking at the moment with an AI revolution and a bargain that says you only get what your output per hour is as a return on your time spent in the economy, because it disadvantages the lowest paid in society, those who are dedicating their time to care. Those who are putting their lives in the service of others are disadvantaged by a system which says you must work faster and faster each hour. You must see more and more patients in your surgery each hour. You must have a bigger and bigger classroom size. Your nurse must get round her nurse round faster and faster each hour, because that's what that incentive driving people through labour productivity gives us. You must play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faster and faster each year, because otherwise you're not inducing the labour productivity that contributes to the quality of your life. That bargain is broken, and we saw that, and again the figures were mentioned in an earlier session. The return to capital has increased over the last 30 years in Europe. The return to wages has fallen, and that is an increase in inequality, a breaking of the bargain, and indeed a place where we have to ask whether the model itself is not broken. If we go down an AI, digitalized, highly technological, highly capital-intensive route in which most of that capital is owned by a minority of people, we will see an increase in inequality. And we have to find a way to get over that leap and to find, in fact, a new social bargain which says, actually, you contribute to society and you have an income on the basis of that. And that contribution is not judged by how fast you work, how much material you output, how much the climate you destroy. It's actually judged by your contribution to the well-being of society.
The Vice President wants to comment on this.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of points to add. Indeed, as Professor already said, technology is a question how we use it. We can use it for good, we can use it for evil. And so basically it's a question how we handle this. And already now, if you look what we are doing in EU, we are taking care of a number of those tendencies. If we discuss that we are currently undergoing digitization, and one could argue that artificial intelligence is also some kind of a form of this digital transformation, then currently in EU we are discussing what is called digital tax. As forms of work are ending, as ways and means of production are ending, we need also to readjust our redistribution system. So concretely, if economy becomes more digital, we need to see how to tax those new forms of economy, and that's exactly what we are currently discussing. World of work is also changing with, once again, technological change, sharing economy, atypical working contracts, and so on. That's why we came with a proposal which what we call social protection for all, where we say that basically no matter what is a form of employment or what is a form of contract people are in, they still have to contribute and to be covered by social security. So, and I think we'll constantly need to adjust our European social market economy to this changing reality.
And Minister, do you want to have a final word on this? And I want to now get a question from the audience. If anyone has one, this is the time.
I wonder whether we sometimes are not running in circles. I don't know how many people are aware of how many old computers were taken to Africa because Europe and America were getting advanced, so they were getting rid of the old stock. So I'm wondering whether, when it comes to climate change, we are not going to see the same trends come, where Europe gets better, and of course the advanced world, but then European companies are, because in one way or another, they will continue to advance themselves using the resources down south, helping in sort of helping the countries down south to advance themselves, but actually promoting the same policies that have got Europe into this mess.
I may react to that. I think this is an excellent point. This is a very good point, because climate change is not a matter of Europe. Actually, when one looks at the data, it's the rest of the world which is now contributing to increasing the issues. No? We have made lots of progress in the last decades. And so this is a global issue, and this is very right that you put this on the table. At the same time, Europe needs to lead in this process, because maybe we are more advanced than other parts of the world in a number of areas, because there is this social sensitivity, but we need to take into account this process and how to ensure that these standards are also leading policies in the rest of the world. I think we're trying to do this in the international negotiations. We have to lead by example. If we manage to succeed in this transition, which I think was your point, I mean, we need to make this process a success, and then other people are going to actually follow this lead. You know, that's why we absolutely need to make sure that we succeed in this process before it's too late, but also that we make this a performing, successful transition. Otherwise, you're very right, you know, at the end of the day, if the rest of the world does not adjust, Europe can do so much, you know, in terms of fighting climate change and all these issues.
Yeah, again, I agree with a very important point that you've made, and I would in fact broaden the point to the fact that if you look at which is the part of the world that's most susceptible and most going to be affected by climate change, it is not the north but the south. It is the higher temperature parts of the world, and they tend to be the lower income parts of the world. And so, you know, this discussion is even more important to their lives, to the low-income countries, and this is something that the global community has to keep in mind. It is important for Europe to take the lead, also and everybody else to do so in reducing the climate risk. But it's also important to keep in mind that there are very serious financial risks for low-income countries, because disasters, I mean, wipe out 25% of their income. I mean, these are very large, major events. That's one. Secondly, they have to make very large amounts of investment in adapting to the climate change, besides mitigation. And that is, again, a budget that these countries do not have. So I think there has to be a bigger global discussion about how exactly is it that we're going to keep the planet ready for the future, both health-wise, livelihood-wise, and financially.
And I know there was a few more questions, and we have more questions from social media. We will go back to that. But before, I want to ask the Vice President, we've just had a European election. It's worth noting that pro-European parties actually won a majority there. The center is still holding, but there has been pushback, and we've seen it in France, we've seen it, well, across Europe. How do you bridge that gap? Europeans who want to feel part of the European Union will have a desire for Europe, but still there's a social pushback against specific measures.
Well, indeed, if you look at the composition of new European Parliament, there is a clear pro-European majority, but the Parliament is more fragmented. So there are forces to the right, forces to the left, there are kind of Eurosceptic forces. So I would say from the point of view of functioning European Parliament is used to the coalition building around other issues. So if there is a political will from pro-European political groups, certainly there will be a functioning European Parliament. But then the question is really whether Europe delivers on the concerns of the citizens. And I think that's what we should be concentrating on in our policies, and that's why we are putting lots of emphasis on, as I was saying, inclusive growth, of strengthening the social dimension when discussing our macroeconomic and fiscal policies, because clearly people want to see the benefits of economic growth, and we have good macroeconomic figures, and we are in the 7th year of economic growth and so on. People want to see those benefits in their pockets, so to say. And also this concerns, for example, fight against climate change. We see there is increased demand for action against climate change, and we should be also responding to this at the European level.
And Minister, oftentimes we are told populism does well when you have very difficult problems that get apparently solved by very easy answers. The reality is sometimes different. How do you make sure that these sustainable policies are explained to people, but also that the cost of it is shared evenly in a society?
That's a very good point, but I was thinking as Valdis was replying to the previous one, is this very interesting thing that we're seeing, that it's the young that are really leading this process, no? I think that if we want to behave responsibly, we have to listen to them, and we have to make sure that we deliver a better future for them. And they're teaching us a lesson, you know, to a certain extent, by being so pushy and so demanding and saying, we want to have our future, you know, you cannot spend it all. And I think that is probably the main driver. I was thinking about this as we were thinking about Europe and all the tensions that we are seeing and the Euroscepticism, etc. I actually think this is an agenda which would galvanize the young and would give a better future and a better prospect for all of them. And we cannot fail them, because otherwise we're going to be facing difficult situations in the future. We were talking about growth. We will go through recessions or lower growth periods in the future. You know, cycles are not dead. They will come back. If we don't manage to deal with these long-term societal issues, we're going to be losing support by the people for the project and for our future. But I don't want to sound pessimistic, because actually I'm very positive that the drive that we're seeing from the young people is actually showing us that they do think we can change things, that we can deliver this better future, and it is our responsibility not to make the mistake now, you know, that we have the chance to take these decisions.
And Professor Gopinath, from an economic perspective, what policies would you suggest to make sure that the average person on the street feels like there is something in it for me? What specific policies would you say would be seen as more inclusive or should be more inclusive?
I think there is not one particular policy, but I think there are a whole host of them, because among the factors that come into well-being, we saw there were a whole host of them. There were on health, education, on inequality, on the environment. So I think there are, policies on multiple fronts. But before we end on a terribly pessimistic note, I just want to flag that we have seen one of the biggest declines in global poverty over the last 20, 30 years. And so if you think in terms of world inequality, there has been a decline in world inequality. So some good things have come about. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with the problems of today. But I think it is important to keep in mind that, firstly, I think there is a bit of a gap between intention and actual implementation and what we see happen, right? I don't think anybody here, even in the policy world, will disagree that we need to do more for the climate and we need to do more for redistribution, but how that translates into actual policy is still missing. So we need to really use the fiscal system. We need to use taxes. We need to use subsidies to encourage, for instance, firms to undertake cleaner kind of investment. We need to ensure that big corporations actually pay their fair share of taxes, and there's no tremendous amount of profit shifting that you see around the world. We have to make sure that that happens. In Europe, in the European Union, in the euro area, an example is about having one single market for services, right? There's been an EU services directive that's been around for over 10 years, the principle of which was to have one single market for services. That hasn't happened to the degree that was anticipated initially. So there was a bit of a gap between intention and what happens, and I think the next focus of the Commission has to be about closing that gap.
And Professor Jackson, one of the ideas that you floated, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that perhaps as a society we should be satisfied with less. So I have two questions for you. Doesn't that actually defy human nature? And two, wouldn't that add fire to populists if you say, you know what, you're happy with what you have, that's it?
No, I think we should be satisfied with more. I think we've been sold less. And we've been sold less in very specific ways. I mean, I do think there are the very clear messages that come out of the vote, and I absolutely agree that the focus on green issues is something that's come off the streets, it's come from kids, it's come from activists, and also the other message from the streets, which we can't forget, of course, is from the voices of those who've been dispossessed and left behind, sold a dream of more, but a reality of less. And you know, I think we are at a kind of a turning point. I mean, when my kids were very young, I used to take them walking a lot, sometimes up quite high hills. And I have a wonderful picture of my youngest daughter in a pair of boots and a rucksack, determined to stay up with her older siblings, because they were enjoying an activity that cost absolutely nothing, really, except the exertion of moving along your feet. And in those early years, I used to have to drag them along almost incessantly. And then after a few years, I began to realize that they were much more willing participants in the race. And then there was a turning point, and I began to realize that I was the one being dragged along. And that's, for me, is exactly what's happening at the moment. I've worked for 30 years in sustainability and in sustainability economics. I've put proposals to 5 or 6 different governments. I've worked with 2 or 3 of those governments. I've worked with the UN. I've contributed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I've been saying these things for a very long time. And now I look out and I see those people who contributed to those changes in the European politics telling me I'm not moving fast enough. And that's, you know, aside from the fact that, of course, it neglects my own pride in having achieved so much over those 30 years, is, in fact, the biggest legacy, I think, of those 30 years' work that I could have ever have hoped for, that there is a bunch of people telling me that I am not moving fast enough in this area. And it's not just telling me that, it's telling European Parliament that, it's telling the politics, global politics that, it's telling the politicians on the street that, it's telling the policymakers that, it's telling the banks that, it's telling the financial institutions that, it's telling the supranational bodies that. The politics of the past is broken, and the world is not a place of less in the future. Actually, it's a better place. There was a wonderful quote from the wife of Kenneth Boulding once said that anyone who thinks that economic growth on a finite planet can go on forever is either a madman or an economist. And my favorite quote, though, is a quote from his wife, who in 1955, Elise Boldman, said, "The consumption society has focused too much on teaching us the happiness of having things and too little on the happiness of having less." And that is a vision, it seems to me, not for an economy which you're selling people less, but an economy where you're selling them more. You're selling them a better quality of life, a better health system, more robust communities, better relationship, more time with their friends and family. That is a new dream that needs to replace the old dream of ever-increasing growth. Europe can no longer deliver it. Gita, in one of her early interventions, actually admitted it. The growth rate across Europe is declining. We're not in a place where we have that luxury anymore to depend on that old dream. And in any case, it was the wrong dream. There's a better one.
And Mr. Illy, I want to ask you, what can business actually do to bring in citizens? And I guess some will tell you there's a perception that corporations are not always fair, but I guess maybe you can disagree with that and actually say, well, business creates job. We have a reputation that maybe is not entirely fair. So I want to get your thoughts on that.
So first of all, I think we need really a culture of sustainability, and that needs a commitment of the public administration and a commitment by companies, and later on even by all the citizens. So I think that first of all we need to improve the education regarding sustainability, both social and environmental, in the school. It exists, it's not homogeneous in the countries, not homogeneous in the different schools. So I think we need a program, possibly a European program, to have the same kind of education on sustainability in all the schools existing in Europe. And also entrepreneurs, because their role is important, should be taught. We have, by the way, only very few schools for entrepreneurs. We have many schools for managers, but being a manager is something quite different than being an entrepreneur. And while teaching entrepreneurs, I think we should teach them this sensibility on sustainability. Not all of them are yet attentive to this issue. Even if what I told before regarding Peter Drucker is now taken over by Gary Hamel. He wrote recently a book on the future of management. So he's trying to bring on the principle of sustainability, also telling some very good and successful example, just to say Patagonia in the United States or Whole Foods. And there are many, many other positive examples. Then I think that promoting certification of sustainability by the public administration would be very useful. I wouldn't say to force, but to incentivize all the companies in committing in sustainability. And of course, leading by example would be the right attitude, in this regard the public administration that often has to save money, and so they are not such sustainable because they prefer to spend less and to maybe pollute more. I remember when I was the mayor of Trieste, I found a lot of heating in the public buildings of the municipality of Trieste that were still with heavy oil, which is the most polluting after coal, let's say, product you can use for heating. So if you want to bring this change in the culture, you need to give the example. And the same has to be done by companies, and communication is, of course, very important for companies. I think that the consumer, the majority of consumers are already ready to pay more for sustainable products. A demonstration is the growth in the sales of organic products, but also for companies that cannot claim their products are organic, but they are nevertheless committed in sustainability. I think that better communicating what they are doing can be important, both to be successful despite the higher costs that normally are linked to sustainability, but also to spread this culture of the sustainability to the public. And in conclusion, I would say that also private-public partnership in order to promote and communicate sustainability would be useful. Normally, partnerships are quite difficult, especially when you are following economic purposes projects. But if the project is about communicating sustainability, I think it's much more easy to exploit this kind of mean of public-private cooperation.
Thanks very much. We've had a number of questions come in again. One of them, which is very timely, says, will or should the EU change their perception regarding public debt? Should the EU change the perception that it has about debt? Who would like to take that one?
Of course, would be good to know more on the context of this question, but as regards public debt, public debt is something which we can measure and where we have certain EU rules governing public debt. We have Maastricht criteria, basically determining that public debt above 60% of GDP is considered as a risk factor to the economy. We know that the Eurozone on average has higher public debt, it's more than 80, and in some countries it's even higher. But indeed, we had seen it also before that countries with higher debt to GDP ratios are more vulnerable to the economic shocks. So from that point of view, what we are saying now as European Commission is that we should use current good economic times to put budget deficit and also public debt clearly on downwards trajectory. If we talk in EU in general, if we talk about high debt countries, but at the same time we also are recommending to pursue differentiated fiscal policy, meaning that those countries which have fiscal space should use it to stimulate the economy, especially to stimulate the investment. So it has to be, you know, a nuanced look at this.
Does anyone want to?
I mean, I would just add in there that, you know, fiscal spending serves a purpose, especially when it's used for productive investments. And there are plenty of productive investments that need to be undertaken, like we just talked about in the area of climate being one of those, but in the area of raising potential long-run incomes. And there are countries, and I would flag Germany as a country that certainly has the fiscal space to spend more on raising its potential output. At the same time, there are, of course, other countries that don't have as much of a fiscal space to do so. And while at the same time they have to deal with the fact that with aging demographics, they are looking forward to a period of spending on healthcare and on pensions, that's quite high. So one needs to do the right trade-off between the long-run sustainability of your debt, while recognizing the fact that indeed interest rates are incredibly low at this point, which means that countries that do have the fiscal space should use it as a good opportunity to undertake infrastructure spending, investment for the future, including on climate.
Do you want to?
I would just like to reinforce the idea that yes, the EU should think differently about its debt and fiscal rules. Most of them have their origins in or about the Maastricht Treaty in 1991, and then through the Stability and Growth Pact, which produced, as it happens, neither growth nor stability, and has tied economies in Europe into mutual inequality in very, very specific ways. And that was pointed out, obviously, most graphically in the case of Germany and Greece, and pointed out very effectively in terms of vocal authority by Yanis Varoufakis at the time at which he, unfortunately, turned up on the wrong vehicle, I think. He turned up on a motorbike too many times, dressed looking like a rebel, to be taken seriously in Europe. But if you look at what he was saying about the structure of the monetary and fiscal rules in Europe, it's actually very, very hard to critique them. And if there is any point in time at which we should be revisiting those rules, then it is now. The argument that governments have to abide by a strict debt ceiling in the same way that households or businesses are is wrong. The econometric work around the level of debt and the receptiveness to instability is wrong. It was proved wrong by a couple of PhD students critiquing a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And so is the idea that it's not possible for governments to sustain quite high levels of public debt in the right circumstances. In Japan, for example, the national debt is around 200% of the GDP. Now, there are very, very specific financial and monetary circumstances surrounding that that allow that to be possible. It's an essential instrument in protecting the well-being of the people and the stability of the economy. It should not be taken away from national governments by arbitrary fiscal or monetary rules.
So the Minister Calviño, I know she wants to comment on this.
Yes, I beg to disagree.
Yes.
Very strongly. Very strongly. Because I have children and I want to have great children, and so I think it's not responsible to leave them a burden of debt, as I do not think it's responsible to leave them with a dirty planet where they will not be able to breathe. And so we have to behave responsibly on both sides. Speaking from the perspective of a country that actually did have problems in getting funding, some years ago, and has suffered instability in capital markets, I don't think that it would be wise to say, oh, it doesn't matter. Your debt level doesn't matter.
I'm not saying it doesn't matter.
No, if I may finish. In particular, it depends on what you're using this money for. So I absolutely do not agree with this. I think that if we want to behave responsibly towards our children and grandchildren, we also have to be responsible in terms of debt and public deficit management.
Go ahead.
And the other point I would make, because sometimes it gets lost in translation, which is that while you're right, that we don't have a well-established relationship between debt and whether there's going to be instability in growth, that doesn't mean that there will be no instability if you raise debt too much. So I think the answer is more that we lack information on it, but it is not that you could simply build up your debt and it would be without consequence. So let's be very clear about that.
And Mr. Illy.
I don't think that Japan is a good example, because almost 100% of the public debt of Japan is paid by the Japanese, is financed by Japanese. So you have an example in Italy where about 1/3 of its 134% on GDP debt is paid by foreigners, and because also of the instability, the political instability, we pay about 250 up to 290 in the last weeks basis points spread compared to Germany. And I think that the markets are ready to understand when you are close to default, and in this case they will raise your spread up to unsustainable levels, as it happened already in Italy in 2011. And I have not to remember that in the history of humanity, we already had many, many states that made default. And of course, someone lost his money. And I don't think we want our citizens or even foreign citizens to lose its money if our country is going to default. But we are in a system, a European Union. We are members of another system, which is the Euro system, and I think it is a task of the European Commission, in one hand, to protect the other countries from the countries that has too high level of indebtedness, like Italy, but in the other hand, to even protect these countries themselves when they are not able to do it by themselves.
Thank you very much. And then time for a question from the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad some economic sense came in the last round of comments. I have to politely disagree with Professor Jackson on the previous round, when you finger-pointed the ECB and Mario Draghi, and I think you are finger-pointing exactly the wrong person. In the same speech of today, which I flipped through, he calls for actually policymakers and governments to take the responsibility by calling for other policies to supplement what monetary policy is doing. So the idea that the central bank should solve the problem of climate change is frankly bizarre. I think what they should do, government should take the responsibility, and actually finger pointing Mario Draghi is precisely the way to absolve them from taking the responsibility in tackling these long-term issues. I think everybody agrees that the ECB and Mario Draghi did what was necessary in order to save the euro, and I think we should not be here politely discussing the climate change should Mario Draghi not having uttered some right words back in 2012 and done the quantitative easing in 2015. Thank you.
Feel free to respond. And time for a question again, still from the audience. We still have time.
May I respond to that question? And
very
perhaps,
quickly,
so,
very briefly.
I am not finger-pointing Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi is a hero, and he's shown himself in that role through 3 very short words, whatever it takes, and backing that with the quantitative easing, the asset purchase sales, the interest rate changes that were necessary to stabilize the situation. That does not change the fact that the situation should not have arisen, that the rules were too puniary, that actually debt is not the same thing as government debt is not the same thing as private debt, which everybody who believes in what you're calling economic good sense seems to insist that it is, whereas the understanding is very, very different. And were it not for that understanding that money for government is not the same as money for household, Mario would never have had 2.6 trillion euros to spend. So the bad economics doesn't sit in this part of the forum today. I'm really glad that I've managed to scare up such disagreement, because I had a conversation with our moderator at the beginning, and it's very definitely what she asked me to do. So I'm glad to have done it. But we have to look beyond the system itself. We have to look beyond the existing rules and saying, yes, if you are Italy under the Eurozone with a 200% debt, you are in deep shit. If you're Greece, the same is true. If you're Germany or if you are Japan, the conditions are very different. Now, the lesson from that is not to say that debt is bad, we're passing it on to our kids. We are in the private sector passing that debt on to our kids. We're not necessarily in the public sector, and asking instead, what are the conditions and what are the monetary and fiscal rules through which Europe could stabilize its economy and deliver climate goals, because I don't believe for a minute that they're options, they are not mutually exclusive goals, and could deliver social inclusion. And it does require us to do that hard institutional work of saying, where did those rules go wrong and how do we put them right?
I guess...
and for the record, what I said was speak your mind freely, even though there may be some disagreements, but that's always good.
Well, I should just be very clear that none of us economists on the panel here equate private debt and government debt. So don't make that incorrect assumption about when we say that debt is something that countries do have to worry about. We are not saying because of the fact that it's exactly like household debt. And there are 2 ways to repay your debt. One is by taxing the future generation. 2 is by printing money and paying for that. One of that takes away resources from the future generation. The second has almost always brought about inflation in many countries in the world. So we can have the exception, and it's possible that we might be in a world where inflation never, ever comes back. But I think that's a really risky stance to take.
Well, we've had lots of questions, and there is a very interesting debate, so I'm very happy for that. But we are running out of time, and I really want to ask you, all of you, very briefly, what should the top priority be for the next European Commission? Because that is ultimately the focus now. Vice President?
Well, of course, it will be for the next European Commission to determine what's their top priority. It's not for this European Commission. But if I may try to give just some points which I think would be relevant. I think one important overarching issue will be this question on sustainable development, climate transition, meeting the goal of climate neutral economy by 2050, because this will require major transformation of the economy, and this will require changes in many different sectors. So if I could put one overarching topic, then of course we can go in all kind of things, starting from Eurozone reforms to banking union to capital markets union. We need to continue work in all those directions, but probably this will be some kind of an overarching topic.
That's great. And I see you're sending your comments, so we definitely want to hear from you. So do send us, what do you think the top priority should be on Slido? We will look at it at the end. And now to go back to the Minister, what should the top priority be?
No, I fully agree that this issue of climate change, because of the global nature and because of the role of Europe in leading in this area, should be one of the top priorities, and we really need to get this right, you know, in the next term. But the other key issue, I think, this issue of inclusive growth, you know, sustainable and inclusive growth, because otherwise we're going to lose part of the European population. We already have in a number of countries. So we need to make sure that Europe continues to be a beacon of welfare. You know, it's not only growth. We were discussing, the first question was precisely about indicators for growth. Do we have the right indicators? Is GDP the right indicator? What I certainly know is that the numbers are cold, you know, concepts are cold if citizens do not feel that they're part and they're benefiting from that growth. So this issue of inclusive growth, I think, should be very high on the agenda of the next Commission.
Professor?
I mean, I think we just have to recognize that without inclusivity, without sustainability, we are not going to get the growth we want. I think that's the bottom line. That all three of them come together. They are macro-critical, so it's in some sense almost pointless to talk about is growth more important or the other one, because they will all come together. In terms of, from the Commission's perspective, this is something I said earlier on, which is I think that there is a bit of a distance between intention and outcomes, and that's a gap that we need to fill. I will emphasize again that we need to have corporations pay their fair share of taxes so that those fiscal revenues can be used exactly for inclusiveness and for climate change, among others. It's important to have equality of opportunity, and not just in terms of words, but using tax and fiscal policy to make that happen. So all of this is important, and this is not something we can push down the road for another 5 or even 10 years, but this is imminent now.
Professor Jackson?
I agree with all the other speakers. I think the Commission and every national government and ourselves really should focus on the things that we want. What we want is sustainability and well-being for all. And that means, I think, the European taking a long, hard look at itself and asking if it has the right instruments and policies, particularly on the fiscal and monetary level. So I would replace, as you might guess, stability and growth as a pact with a sustainability and well-being pact. I would direct the multi-annual financial framework towards the transition that we need to a sustainable, inclusive economy. And if there is to be a further monetary or fiscal stimulus, I think it's absolutely essential that that too doesn't go into the pockets of the richest in society, but is dedicated towards that same transition, sustainability and well-being.
That's perfect. And just final thought before we get to Mr. Illy, do keep sending those answers to those questions, because we will read them out, and it'll be interesting to see whether you are kind of on board. Mr. Illy.
So first of all, I would give a general idea, a general suggestion, which is to focus on few paramount objectives. The tendency of each state, and maybe also of the European Union, is to try to do everything. I think that we should focus on few paramount objectives. Secondly, to facilitate the energy shift from fossil fuels to renewable. I think we are very close to a self-sustaining process, and we have to give a final incentive to entering in the self-sustaining energy shift. Then encourage and support workers' mobility, because we will have to face a lot of creative destruction, and that means that many, many workers will have to change their job, will need to be trained by the public administration, by the companies themselves. So we have to support the workers' mobility. And then I would say prepare to deflation, because we have too many innovation that are bringing to a decrease in costs. Even globalization and digitization, robotization, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, all these are bringing to deflation. So I think that in the next future we will have to face deflation, and we are not ready to do it, because the last time it happened, it was, if I remember well, at the beginning of last century. And finally, I would say communicate more and better. The European citizens know only a minimum part of what the European Union, the Parliament, the Commission, the Council are doing. And I think that the European Union needs more support by the citizens, and with a better communication, you could get it.
Well, great, thanks. So, of course, those are the answers from our speakers, but we wanted to hear from you, and I think you have sent those answers, and we should get them right here behind us. Let's see if technology works. That's great. Okay, so the top mentions are, well, no surprise, climate change, sustainability, inequality, and social cohesion. Thank you very much for sending those. Well, and that is the end of our panel. Hopefully you had a good time. We want to thank our speakers for their time and all of their thoughts. I also want to thank everyone who participated. We had more than 1,000 people here today, so that was great. We've had a lot of mentions on Twitter. It's great that you engage. It's always very good when you do that. And we also have to thank the organizers and DG ECFIN for really putting the time to do this. And hopefully we'll see you next year. There will be a movie showing the economics of happiness in Studio 5 that will be shown at 6 p.m. And there is also a cocktail, so I hope that you all have time to go. Thanks so much.
Life in the baby, you got the life in the baby, loud and the never moves on. You got the life in the baby, you got the life in the baby, you got the life in the baby, loud and the never moves on. I know you got yourself a skinny old man.